Hello, art historians, and welcome to our first lecture on creating the context for Greece. So we are now moving into what I call the art of classicism of the Western world. So Western meaning basically west of Asia. So we're talking about really North America, Europe, and a little bit of Northern Africa. So getting into this, I want to make sure that you understand the first works of art that I'm going to talk about in this lecture are not going to be tested on the 250. They're not included. However, one of the very big objectives that we have for this particular unit that College Board has set forth is that you understand that Greek art and Roman art really get their influences from other cultures around the Mediterranean. So if we leave that part of the story out, then it kind of leaves a big gap in terms of how the art looks. So in order to start with Greek art, we have to start with what is called Aegean art, which is not included on the 250. But when we talk about Aegean art, we're talking about art of the Aegean Sea, which is adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, why is this important? Because everything that you can see here is a part of the Greek city-states, all right? Because the Greeks did not consider themselves to be Greece the way that they do today. They all had their allegiance to their individual city-states. Some of them were democracies. Well, Athens was a democracy. Some of them had two kings. Some of them had one king. Really, the only thing that they had in common was they all spoke the same language and they were all polytheistic. That's really about it. But these city-states, as you can see here, are very separated by water. They're very separated by mountains. The geography of Greece very much shaped who it was because they were very separated from each other. And as a result of that, they're going to really have very little contact with each other in terms of friendliness. A lot of it really has to do with fighting and competition. What's really going to happen is because they had so much water access and very little farmable land, they're going to have a lot of contact with people around the Mediterranean, mainly through the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea. So we can see the beginning of Greek art really start to happen in the Aegean Sea and also in Africa with the Egyptians. So just to kind of show you where we're talking about, the Aegean Sea right here, okay, which kind of is the embodiment of those Greek city-states along with the Mediterranean. The Greek city-states were generally incredibly good sailors because they had to be, because Greece itself is not really good for agriculture or for growing things. So if you're going to raise a population, you need to be able to go out and get and trade what you want, which is also another reason that Greek ideas, and because their art represents their ideas, are going to spread so much because they did travel so frequently. So when we're talking about the Aegean Sea, I'm going to keep this pretty short because, again, it's not tested on the 250, but it is an important part of the background, all right? So our understanding of Greek art and the fact that a lot of what the Greeks talked about in like their legends and the Odyssey and the Iliad really did come from, truth and some basis of truth comes from archaeological excavations that really started to get going in the 1800s and 1900s. So they had in Europe this understanding of these stories like Odysseus, and they wanted to find out, were these stories really, really true? Were there some basis to it? So we see guys like Heinrich Schliemann, who was trying to figure out if the city of Troy was real, if Mycenae was real, which is the city-state that ended up fighting with Troy, along with Sparta. Sir Arthur Evans was trying to find out if the Palace of Minos, where the Minotaur myth kind of came from on Crete, was real. And in doing so, they actually figured out that the Greek history that was talked about in the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you removed the fact that a lot of it was based on gods and goddesses and things like that, was based on events that actually did happen. So what we know from the archaeological excavations, because those really got people interested in this area. And the more that they started to do archaeological excavations in this area, the more they started to find art and artifacts, especially buried in the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea. So here's what we know about the Greeks, basically from what we found, because we found evidence of Greek influence all over the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea, is they're incredible sailors, as I mentioned. And a lot of what we found early on has to come from shipwrecks that they found. So like, for example, on these boats that were definitely Aegean and of Greek origin, we found evidence of contact with other cultures, which leads us to believe that their beliefs and their art systems and their art, the way that they do their art, is going to really start to be influenced by other places that they encountered. So for example, Egypt, they found Egyptian scarab beetles, like gold scarab beetles, on these Aegean or Greek shipwrecks. They found materials from Africa, like ivory and ebony. They found metals that weren't native to the Greek areas. So this really, the more expeditions they did after they found Troy and after they found the Palace of Minos on Crete, they started to go, okay, let's see what else we can find. And in finding in the Aegean these shipwrecks, it started to show that the Greeks did have a great deal of contact with other cultures around the Mediterranean. So one of the big findings came from, and this is huge, they found on the island of Crete, which is where they found the Palace of Minos, which would have been where the whole idea, because there was this great big labyrinth or maze where they believe that the story of the Minotaur, which is half bull and half man in Greek mythology, may have come from. So this is some of the art that we found in this area on the island of Crete. And if you look at it, and if you stop and think for a second, you have a male on this side and you have females on this side. And what you're looking at is basically this idea of women having lighter skin and male being shown in darker skin, which, if you remember, is something that we saw in Egypt. And if you're looking at the way that this Minoan wall painting, this figure is standing, he's kind of got that composite view that you would see in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, remember, we do know that later on the Greeks are going to have a great deal of contact with the Egyptians. In fact, we know that the Pythagorean theorem came from them studying the pyramids, which would have been around a lot later. But the point here is, you're looking at evidence way, way earlier, before Greece was even really Greece, that the people of the Aegean who will become the Greeks were having a great deal of contact with the people of Egypt, which will play a role in influencing their steps in their art. So we know the Minoans lived on this island of Crete. We know from their paintings that they were an incredibly fun-loving culture. They didn't really worry about invasion a whole lot. Everything that they do is kind of fluid, in fact, like so very fluid lines that they created in their art, as you can see here. Everything seems to be about fun and competition and just living and enjoying life. It's not nearly as serious as the Egyptians, but these guys didn't need to be. They were very isolated and on their own. And part of what came from this, or what inspired people to discover this area and really excavate it, was this obsession with this legend of, was there this half bull, half man kind of creature that was living on this island? All right, so King Minos, the legend actually said, was the ruler of Crete and had this palace of Knossos, which they actually found the remains of. And the story was he kept in his labyrinth a half bull and a half man, right? So kind of like a thing that he would sacrifice to, which basically it's the early Hunger Games, because they would send 14 young men and women each year from different city-states in the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea to sacrifice to the Minotaur. So it's kind of like this early Hunger Games thing. And the Minotaur was supposedly the son of King Minos' wife and Poseidon's bull, which was actually Poseidon. So basically his wife had an affair with Poseidon. They had this half bull, half man child, and King Minos, in a fit of rage, decided to take it and use it as a beast. And the story is the Minotaur is finally killed by Theseus, kind of like, I guess Katniss would be, or Peeta in the Hunger Games, that they went and actually fought and killed this thing. But the wonder was, did such a place actually exist? So Sir Arthur Evans comes along, finds the Palace of Knossos. He actually finds the thing, and inside of it is this great abundance of wall paintings that were in there, and they named the civilization the Minoans after the Minotaur, because that's the whole thing that inspired this thing. So this discovery really made people start to take a great deal of interest in Greek history and Greek artifacts and excavations like that, because Rome had already had its moment. They discovered Pompeii in the 1700s. So Rome had already gotten its moment, but what about the Greeks, who so greatly, influenced the Romans? So this was the palace that the Minoans had actually built. And you can see here that clearly these people were not at all worried about ever being attacked, because in terms of fortification, this is a terrible palace. So we know that they weren't really good planners and they were kind of laid back. But because they had built this massive palace and focused more on beauty rather than war, we have all this art left behind that kind of does prove to us that they did have a great deal of contact with Egypt, and that the Minoans on this island of Crete were kind of like the stepping stone from like art getting from Egypt influence into the Mediterranean Sea, moving up into the Aegean, and eventually into what we know as Greece today. This is just an aerial view of what remains of this palace. Again, not a very practical idea, but one thing that is very interesting, if you notice, that's going to kind of be adopted in Greece, is you'll notice that the columns that we have remaining on their palace taper from top to bottom, because this way it's almost like a shock absorber, because this area gets hit with earthquakes all the time, and they were wooden columns instead of marble. So we know that the Greeks are going to kind of build on this, but where did these guys get the idea to use columns in the first place? Most likely the Egyptians, and then the Greeks are obviously going to take their own spin on it because they have way more marble available and we're a little bit better at engineering. So this is the type of art that we found on the walls in the Minoan culture, right, in the island of Crete. And you can see here some real evidence that we've got a fresco painted onto a wall, which means you basically do painting onto wet or dry plaster. If it's wet plaster, you have to move quickly because it dries very quickly. So that means that you don't have time to make these fine little detailed lines like the Egyptians did to make everything perfect. You could be much more fluid, kind of like this line over the bull. And you can see this is actually a bull festival, which of course they have this obsession with bulls on this island. But we know that they probably were a little bit more egalitarian, just like the Egyptians, and that women probably had a little bit more rights like the Egyptians, because here we've got a female, which we know because she's lighter skinned, like we would see in Egypt, and we have a male in darker skin, and they're both participating in the same activity. So just some terms for you to take away from this. This is called the Toreador fresco or bull fresco. You don't have to know it for the 250, but at least do know the terms fresco, all right, which is a painting technique. So it's a way to paint, all right? It's a way that work is produced where you actually place paint on wet plaster. All right, which means if you do that, it actually seals into the plaster a little bit better if it's wet rather than it's dry, which means it can flake off. All right, so this is actually buon fresco or true fresco, which means it's on wet plaster. And you can see that here because the lines are much more fluid because you don't have that time to make very precise straight lines. And again, we're able to see these things that were like, they're different from Egypt because there's a lot more motion and energy and kind of a very happy lifestyle, whereas Egypt worries more about death. But on the other hand, we see some things that really make us realize that this could be some serious Egyptian influence. Please excuse my cat whisper behind me. She likes to hang out with me when I do this. So this is buon fresco or true fresco, which is that idea of applying paint, wet paint, to a wet plaster wall. And frescoes are actually going to be a technique that's very popular in Greece and in Italy in years to come. Now, just to back up, sorry. Fresco secco is what we would see more in Egypt, where it's actually going to be more dry. So if they did plaster in Egypt, it was dry and then you painted onto it, which allowed Egypt to have much more of that straight lines as you go. All right, so again, we see here, this is just kind of interesting, I think, that we think that the Minoans may have been the people to come up with the very first nature scene, like an actual landscape that has no human beings in it, because nature was such a big part of who these people were. So maybe we can see that they're definitely becoming a little bit more advanced than other people because they were less human-centered. Now, what is eventually going to happen is you can tell by their palace designs that these people are clearly not worried about being attacked, like ever. So right here is Crete, and here's the Palace of Knossos. And what's going to happen is some of these city-states on the area that we know today as Greece that are located in the Aegean are going to become very aggressive because there's such limited resources in this area, which, you know, basically Crete was isolated from. So we have Mycenae. And what Mycenae decided to do was start attacking other places, to start establishing supremacy and power, because they have to. They're surrounded by other enemies. These are the people that we know start to create the Greek myths about the heroes. Because if you're in a military-based culture, you want kind of heroes and examples of things to look to model yourself after and not model yourself after. Because even Odysseus and Achilles, they were all these great men, but at the same time, they had these struggles that they had that were very, very mortal. So when we see the Mycenae or Mycenaeans, we see them start to come in and become much more violent and much more hostile. So for example, you can see right here that this is the type of palace that the Mycenaeans or Mycenae would have built, because these were warfaring people. They were not going to be the type of people who built something just for fun. And we can see here these developments in how to build really sturdy buildings with stone. So that's going to be kind of something that will help the Greeks as well. What they are going to come up with is another term that you guys need to know. So again, you don't need to know these pieces for the 250, but you do need to know these terms. So one of the things that they came up with was something called Cyclopian Masonry, which of course they came up with the myths. So they would know about the Cyclops, this giant beast that has just one eye that's incredibly strong. So what they come up with, because they need such strong defense, is these buildings made of these very, very big rocks. All right. So masonry is like stonework, and these were Cyclopean masonry. They were huge rocks that were cut into irregular shapes to kind of fit together like a mosaic or a puzzle without using mortar. And mortar is like the wet stuff that you put between like bricks on a house to hold them together. This didn't have that. This is like, nope, these bricks are heavy enough and strong enough that nobody's going to be able to move them. We don't have time to wait for plaster to dry. We're going to fit these rocks together to make sure that they support this, that they are going to be, you know, strong enough to withhold enemies, because they're going to have a lot of them. And we can see this in the Lion's Gate of Mycenae, which is into one of their big fortresses. We can still see that post and lintel is still working, because why wouldn't it? Let's go back. You can see right here, you got post and lintel right here in the doorway. It's definitely working for them, so they're going to keep that going, all right? But one thing that they did do is kind of start to move towards an early arch, right? And what we see here, if I can go back, okay, we see two lions and this column, which you notice tapers from top to bottom, all right, which is kind of a Minoan thing that maybe they adopted from them. But notice that column is standing alone. It doesn't stand on anything. So kind of showing that they have conquered this. They also created something called the corbeled arch. So a very early arch. And if you see right here, this is what a corbeled arch is. It's not an arch that supports its own weight by locking in that keystone up at the top. That's going to come much later. But a corbeled arch is where you take those rocks and successively move them in like this. Basically just an upgrade on the post and lintel, except now your lintel is a stacked series of almost an early arch. So we do see a big deal with burial arts in the Mycenaeans. And why would that be the case? Because they are a military culture. So you want to make sure that your warriors are buried and remembered. And what we have found is that they buried with huge amount of objects like clothes and jewelry and weapons. And we have found evidence in these tombs that they created funerary masks. So what they would do is after the person died, they would take a gold mask and shape the gold over the face. So they would actually take like a mold of the face and then put the gold over it and like plaster it down, or like hot gold, molten gold, to actually get the shape of the mask. And it became a death mask. Think of where we've seen that before. We've seen that in Egypt with King Tutankhamun's tomb, who was also buried with a great deal of wealth. Now, would these people have seen King Tut's tomb? No. But by the time they were around, there would have been tombs still remaining that they could have seen, perhaps from people who robbed this area. So maybe they were taking this idea along with them too. Now, this is just kind of crazy because it was always curious as to whether or not they had found, because remember, they were trying to prove that whether these Greek stories were true. And if you've ever seen the movie Troy, or you've ever seen, heard the story of the Iliad or of Troy, or of Helen of Troy. So here's what happens, all right? So there was a man named Menelaus. He was the king of Sparta, and he had this beautiful, beautiful wife named Helen, all right? And there was actually a visit from Troy, okay, to Sparta, and it was Hector and his brother Paris, and Paris is the younger brother. And Helen falls madly in love with Paris. She's very unhappy with Menelaus, and she sneaks away on a boat with Paris to go back to Troy. Menelaus is very, very upset about this. His brother is the king of Mycenae, and his brother, who really hates Troy and wants to defeat it, says, let's have Mycenae and Sparta join together and launch an attack, all right? And we're going to go and attack this area, all right? We're going to go, get your wife back, all right? So when he gets there, all right, when these two warriors get to Troy, they can't get past the walls of Troy. And this is where you see these great warriors show up, like Achilles, who goes to fight for Sparta and Mycenae, even though he doesn't want to, and Odysseus, who also goes to fight for Agamemnon, all right? This is when the battle keeps going, and it kind of looks like it's won. Achilles actually kills Hector, which is kind of this huge deal, because Paris tried to fight Menelaus and couldn't beat him, so Hector killed Menelaus instead. So what ends up happening is the Spartans decide they're going to pretend to leave. And what they do instead, Agamemnon's men build this great Trojan horse because it's in Troy, which the Trojans think is a gift. And they are brought into the city, and at night they sneak out and burn down the city of Troy. All right, so that's the big famous story about this. So what people thought is when they found one of these death masks from this area, they were like, oh my gosh, we found the death mask of Agamemnon. It's not. It wouldn't have been. However, it does show that they have these gold death masks that may have been very highly influenced by Egypt. We also start to see that the Mycenaeans are very good at ceramic pottery, which is something that the Greeks are also going to adopt and use, which is going to be a big part of Greek culture. Their pottery was actually functional and decorative because it was meant to be like showing what their values were and this military values, but these also because if you were marching in battle and somebody died, you couldn't take time to dig a huge deep grave for them and build like this big monument. So what you would do instead is drill some holes in the bottom of a pot like this, pour wine into it to give the deceased one last drink, and then leave this as a grave marker. So it kind of establishes using things like this as grave markers. So why is Aegean art so important? Why do I take the time to tell you this? Well, the College Board has on one of their objectives that you realize that basically the Greeks were influenced by other cultures in the Mediterranean. And through Aegean art, we can see that Aegean art is kind of that stepping stone going into Greece from Egypt, because we can see so many things that were adopted by them. So when we talk about Greek history, all right, Greek history is divided up into different time periods. And just like it's going to be with Rome, we can see the art change as different things happen in history. All right, so first we have what we were talking about. The Greek history really begins with the Mycenaeans, all right, because that's kind of where Greek mythology begins. So it would be understanding that that's where kind of like their history begins. And this is called the Bronze Age. And then after the Mycenaeans collapsed, who obviously weren't very intellectual people, they were more warfaring people, Greece goes into what's called a Dark Age. And a Dark Age just basically means there's not a lot of advancement going on. There's not a whole lot happening at this time. Then as we move ahead, all right, so when we enter the 8th century, so that would be the 700s, all right, we start to see them getting back out there again, all right? After all the warfare has kind of stopped and the infighting has kind of ended, this geometric period, they start bringing art back, but it's very, very simple, all right? So very geometric in shape, which if you think about it, so is Egyptian art, all right? It's very stylized, very blocky, even female anatomy was done through like triangles, all right? So kind of showing they're returning to civilization. They're starting to make art again. It's just kind of very, very geometric. Then we see in the 7th century or the 600, we see what's called the Orientalizing period. And Oriental means other or outside. So we start to see that the Greek city-states are starting to interact with people in the Mediterranean again, particularly civilizations that are thriving, like the Egyptians and Mesopotamia. Persia is starting to kind of show up at this time, and eventually the Greeks and the Persians will clash. Then we get what's called the Archaic period. And the Archaic period, archaic means old. This is when we start to see the Greece that we really know take shape, where we start to see city-states develop, where they start to decide who their loyalty is to and what the geographic boundaries of that look like. This is when the Greeks start to develop this idea of humanism, which I'll explain in a second, which is a big part of who they are. Then in the 500s, all right, we're going to see what's called the classical period. And the classical period is when Greece has a period of peace where they're able to start developing the ideas and the art and architecture that goes with that idea, those ideas that will last into modern day. Then what we're going to start to see happen is over time during this classical period, the Greeks become a little bit arrogant after they beat the Persians. They have victory in the Persian War. And then as a result of that, they start to kind of fight amongst themselves over who is the most powerful, because they had all joined together for the first time ever to fight against the Persians. Well, after there was nobody else to fight, they only viewed each other as a threat, and that leads to a civil war. And that civil war will allow Macedonia, north of Greece, to come in and take over basically all of Greece. And for the first time ever, the Greeks were actually united because they were all ruled by first Philip of Macedon and then his son Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great is going to spread Greek culture all the way into India. He's going to defeat Egypt, he's going to defeat Persia, and he's going to go all the way into India before he is defeated and dies, before his troops turn around because they got into India and didn't want to fight elephants and they turned around. So when this happens, all right, we see after that the death of Alexander the Great up through the Roman conquest. And this is called the Hellenistic time period, where Greek art really starts to kind of mingle in the different areas where it was spread when Alexander was alive. So again, I've kind of already talked about this and I'm not going to spend a lot more time on it, but you can see by looking at the topography of Greece and the geography that where you are is definitely who you are. They are majority islands, mountains, and water. Not a whole lot grows here unless it's like olives, or you can raise goats, which is why they have a lot of goat cheese, like feta cheese, or, if you ever had a Greek salad. So because of this, all right, because of all this competition over what's available, they are going to frequently fight each other, these city-states. And obviously the two most powerful are going to be the ones we know about, that's Athens and Sparta. Athens is very good on water because they're water-based, so they're a navy. Sparta is very good on land, and their culture is definitely going to show that because they're going to be a very militaristic culture. And they're constantly fighting with each other over supremacy because they're the two dominating forces at this time. But because, if you can see here, Crete, which is where the Minoans were in the Aegean Sea, that is a nice stepping point between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Greeks to kind of show where that influence is going to come from. So again, talked about this already. The mountains to the Greeks are going to be very, very important. And this is not uncommon. Any place that had a lot of mountains, like India, we're going to see this happen. Mountains were so high up and so inaccessible. Of course, that's where they believed the gods lived, all right? And to them, the farming god, or like the sun god, is not going to be as big a deal because they weren't as into farming in the Greeks. We're going to see other much more major gods like Zeus, the creator god of all things. And of course, there is a sun god, but there's also Ares, the god of war, and Aphrodite, the god of love. And for the first time, we're really going to see gods that have to do with like human emotions, but I'll get to that in a second. So of course, they believe that the gods lived at the top of Mount Olympus because that's the highest point that they could see. A major idea that the Greeks are going to come up with, I get asked all the time why Greeks are such a big deal, all right? Why is this so important, all right? The Greeks have a completely different, now I should say Greeks, Athens, more than anybody else, had this really different idea than everybody else. Their view of the world was much more human-centered rather than God-centered. These are the first people to say that humans, if they look like the gods, because their gods look like humans, they're not like animals. They can become animals, but they look like humans, and they act like humans because they get jealous, they get angry, they lose their temper, they cheat on their spouses. Like, they're very human. They believe that their humans were just as important as the gods. And if that's the case, then humans have a responsibility to try to be perfect in every single way. It was their responsibility to be as intellectually perfect and physically perfect. So they created art that reminded people of those values and that that's who you should always try to be. Like basically this was the motivational poster for the Greeks. Like this is just do it. This is who you should be. Because they believed that they could reach godlike perfection because the gods created them and they were just as important. These were the first people to say that I don't think we get sick because the gods made us sick. I think that the gods made us with bodies, and our bodies have humors in them, like blood, that gets out of balance. So like instead of praying to the gods if you got sick, they would say, hey, Hippocrates would say, hey, you know what? They've got too much red humor if their cheeks are red, if they have a fever. So cut them open and that will actually, make them turn white based on observation and not just on a belief. Yes, you're turning white because you're dying, but at least, you're moving in the right direction. So the biggest quote for humanism is that man is the measure of all things. Like they truly believe this, that man should be what we measure against, that the gods are just as equal to the humans, and we should understand this world that we live in and question everything. That's why the Greeks create the humanities, like things that humans create, like arts. And these were the first people to write down history because it's what humans do. This was an entirely new philosophy, all right? So they only differed from the gods in terms of immortality. That was it. And they believe that the way to reach immortality is to be remembered through your achievements. And like if you watch the movie Troy, you'll notice that Achilles, that's a huge thing for Achilles, is I have to be remembered. I have to be remembered. I have to do something great so that I'm remembered. It was his weakness, all right, that he had to do this. So the Greeks were all about, I have to do things to be remembered. I have to contribute. I have to be smart. I have to come up with something. So they did come up with stuff. They came up with theater, where you go watch humans act out tragedies and comedies so that you could learn from human mistakes and human tragedies. They took the gods completely out of the equation because they were like, humans could be godlike. And what we start to see is this idea of rationality. And rational means you do things because they make sense. It's not based on your belief, all right? So for example, an irrational behavior would be to be like, I'm not going to school today. I've got a zit on my face and everybody's going to look at it and laugh at me. That's irrational because not everybody will actually see you, and B, not everybody actually cares. Rational is, okay, maybe one or two people will see it, but they probably actually won't care. So these ideas are going to be very, very evident. This idea of humanism and rationality and perfection are going to be everything to the Greeks. So again, this is what we see with perfection. And what we're also going to see is the artwork that they created is so perfect, it's not actually possible, all right? So for example, these statues right here, these are called the Riachi warriors. They were actually found in the Mediterranean Sea. They're not possible. In order to achieve like this, your muscles in the front and your back would have to be flexed at the same time. Try it. Try to flex your muscles in your front and your back at the same time. I know you just tried. It doesn't work. It's not possible. This guy's also missing a tailbone, and he's also missing one rib. So to get this image of perfection, because he is perfectly balanced, it's not possible. It's so perfect, it's not possible. They actually came up with a golden ratio of proportions of this is what proportions look like for everything, including the perfect beauty. They found that out of this is the forehead to nose, nose to chin, side to side. Anything that they do should be mathematical and balanced. These are the people who came up with geometry, because everything had to be perfectly balanced and proportioned, and figuring out the ratio and the scale to make it all look balanced. This, by the way, in case you're curious, there are people who do meet the golden ratio of perfection for the Greeks in terms of what they considered beauty, and these are some of them. And if you notice, they're some of the most attractive people to ever, be recognized by celebrity culture. Angelina Jolie is also, which is kind of crazy that she married Brad Pitt and they were both perfect, so go figure. It's no surprise that the Greeks are the first people to, in Athens, I should be clear, Athens, because Sparta was not a democracy, neither were the other ones. But the Greeks were the first people to apply that rational thinking to government, because they would say that the gods don't need to give us our laws like Hammurabi. We don't need a god king like a pharaoh. We're humans. We can learn and be rational and come up with good laws ourselves, which is why they weren't all about divine right, like these laws came from the gods or a god. They actually said, no, we are. Now, they weren't completely rational, because they said that women could not participate in this and could not be educated. So therefore, they weren't there yet, but neither was the United States, because we didn't let women vote until 1919, just saying. But here we've got this idea that adult males who were property owners in Athens, they could be part of making these decisions about what was good for the city-state, because they were there and they were intellectual beings, which was huge. No absolute rule, only government by themselves. Demos, Kratos, power by the people. Demos is people, Kratos is power, all right? And it's all about what's good for the city, not necessarily the individual, but what's good for everybody together. So why did the Greeks actually end up getting into it in the Persian War in the first place? This war that's so often talked about, and why it's going to be such a big deal. Well, Persia, as they defeated Mesopotamia, was starting to move even farther to the west, and they had actually attacked a Greek city-state named Sardis. And Athens stuck their nose where it didn't belong. They picked a fight and helped Sardis beat Persia, because the Greeks are all about self-rule and not absolute rule. And the Persians, if you guys remember, their kings like Cyrus and Darius were all about absolute rule. So they picked a fight with the Persians, and the Persians got mad and said, fine, we're coming for you then. So when they did this, Athens realized very quickly that they could not do this by themselves. And they're like, hey, if this is our problem, it's going to be everybody's problem. So they united all the city-states together that they possibly could, including Sparta. They put their differences aside and said, we're going to fight against this common enemy. So first, we see the Battle of Marathon, right, which is when the Athenians beat the Persians on water with their navy, and then a guy ran back from Marathon or the Battle of Marathon to Athens, declared Nike that they had won. By the way, it's the same length as a marathon, which is why we call it a marathon, and then he dropped dead right there of a heart attack. Then there's the famous Battle of 300 that we know about, which is the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans basically held down this pass so that the Persians couldn't get through, and then they ended up getting surrounded while the Athenians ran away to evacuate Athens, and all the Spartan soldiers died. But it gave Athens time to evacuate and leave, and Persians burned Athens completely to the ground when they did this. But then, when the Persians were leaving, Athens went after them and surprised them with their navy, because the Persians thought they had got them all. And then they beat them finally at the Battle of Salamis. And after this, the Greeks are going to enter what's called their Golden Age. Because in this Golden Age, they had the time to have peace and start coming up with the large works of art and these great works of philosophy, because they had time to think and build and do all of these things. They actually made their democracy even better. They started paying their military. They started paying the people in the government so that they could actually focus on it more. They did trial by jury. They started coming up with these really great ideas. So a big part of their art, especially the Parthenon that we're going to talk about, was really a way to show their power after they had beaten the Persians. So during this time, what we're going to see developed is something called classicism. And this is such an important term for you guys to understand, because classicism in the Schoenhorn definition means so good or so important or so powerful, not always good, that we still use it today, because it's going to stick around for a really long time. And basically it becomes embedded in an idea, and ideas don't go away quickly. So as long as the idea remains, the art and the architecture, which we consider classical, is going to stay with it. So for example, when we think about classical architecture in the Western world, like Europe and the United States, we think Greek and Roman architecture. And it's not because we adopted the architecture, it's because we adopted the ideas of democracy and a republic. And as long as the ideas stay, the art and the architecture stays with it. So we still use it today. So like, for example, if we talk about classic cars are like Mustangs, Corvettes, Camaros. We still have them. They still make them. Now, have they been modified a little bit? Just like democracy now includes women? Yes. But is it still the same idea and same body style? Yes. All right. But here's the important thing. Classical means the same thing everywhere, but it does not look the same. Classical architecture in India or China does not look like classical architecture in Greece or Rome or the Western world. So here's what's going to eventually happen to the Greeks. All right. Athens starts to get very full of themselves, which we're going to see in the art that they create very, very evidently. And they start stealing from a combined treasury of all of these city-states that they put together for the Persian War. They start stealing from it to build their city. And then they build a wall around their city to kind of cut themselves off, which makes everybody else nervous. So what do we have happen? A civil war in the Greek city-states, particularly Sparta and Athens. And the problem with this war, it's a stalemate. It lasts forever. It keeps going back and forth because Athens has a good navy and Sparta is much better on land. So it never goes anywhere until finally Sparta pulls Sparta pulls a really bad trick and asks Persia to help them beat Athens. Because as you can see, Persia is right here. And they ask them, hey, you want to get a little revenge on Athens? Let's put that whole 300 thing behind us and let's go ahead and fight them. And because these city-states were so tired after this war, if you look up here, you see Macedonia. Macedonia was able to come in and defeat all of the Greek city-states and unite them. If you look here in the red, this is all now the Macedonian Empire. So now the Greeks are united, whether you like it or not. But if you notice, even Macedonia doesn't mess with Sparta because they were such that scary, tough military culture. So what did Macedonia mean for Greece? Well, it does unify the Greeks, but Philip II, who took over all of this and created this empire, his son Alexander was taught, by Aristotle, a great Greek philosopher, and he passed on all of this Greek learning, Greek culture, Greek ideas to Alexander. So even though Alexander wasn't technically Greek, he's Macedonian, as he continues to conquer and spread out to other areas, he takes those Greek ideas with him. And as that Greek ideas and culture goes with him, so does the art and architecture. So we're going to see that Greek influence spread out and expand long after Alexander is gone. So what does Alexander do? Well, a lot. He had a lot of daddy issues and really wanted to conquer Persia because his dad could not. So what he does is he goes on this mission to basically conquer Persia because his dad couldn't do it. So in a very short amount of time, he defeats Egypt. He frees Egypt from Persia, sorry. He defeats Persia, burns the palace of Persepolis, which he didn't want to do, and then he goes all the way into India. He was very, very tolerant. He kind of learned from the Persians that if you're tolerant of the areas you take over, the better the transition will be. So what he did is kind of mix Greek culture in with the places that he took over. And I mean that literally and figuratively, because we would see from India Buddhas wearing a toga. But we would also see in Egypt, there was the Great Library of Alexandria, which later, of course, the Romans will burn down. But it was this place of Greek learning and scrolls and gardens and things that he would research to send back to his tutor Aristotle. He would have his soldiers, his Greek soldiers, marry into Persian and Indian and Egyptian cultures. He took a Persian wife. And so what we start to see is he's sprinkling Greek culture all through this area, kind of like sprinkles on top of a sugar cookie icing, where if you have that icing and it's nice and sweet, which is how he treated these people, then the sprinkles will stick better to the icing. I know that's a really bizarre thing, but Greek culture stuck in these areas and their ideas stuck, even though Alexander died. Now, it was either because he drank himself to death, got swamp fever, or was poisoned by his own soldiers because he was starting to act like a god. But either way, even after he dies and his empire splits into 3 pieces, we're going to see that Greek culture remain. So you can see here, this is everything. Macedonia was where he's originally from. Everywhere here, you can see those Greek ideas, that Greek learning spread with him. And you can see, even if the ideas don't spread, the architecture and the art will spread with it and mix in. And because Alexander appreciated Greek culture, that idea of democracy will not die. So now what we're going to see happen after this is what we call the Hellenistic world, all right? And the Hellenistic world is after Alexander died, okay? And Hellenism is a word for Greek. So the Hellenes or the Hellenes were Greek, right? So that's what that means, Hellenes. So what we're talking about here is Greek culture that is going to remain around these areas and kind of settle into these other areas even after Alexander is dead. So, for example, Hippocrates, who comes up with the Hippocratic Oath and advances in medicine, Pythagoras and Euclid, who were geometry, that was after all of this, because the Greek ideas of learning are going to continue even after they have been taken over by the Macedonians. So, for example, once upon a time, you would never, ever, ever have seen Aphrodite in Greek culture as nude. But now, in other places in the world, you'll see statues of Aphrodite, like in Persia or in Turkey, but she is nude because she's not a goddess to them, but she's still like a goddess. She's not one of their big ones, so it was okay to show her nude. And how do we know about all this? Because the Greeks were writing it down. They recorded history, one of the first people to do it, even if it was biased. They actually bashed the Egyptians for using slave labor, which the Greeks had slaves too, so whatever. So this is what's going to happen after Alexander the Great dies. And you can see his empire breaking up into 3 different pieces. All right, so in fact, right here, you can see Ptolemy, and the pharaohs from this point on are actually going to become Ptolemaic pharaohs. So that's going to be their dynasty. Cleopatra, in fact, was way more Greek than she was Egyptian. And you're going to see this Greek kind of culture still remain through this area. So what's going to be cool as we go through this unit is through all of these contextual events, we get to watch the history happen through the art and architecture.